On a fog-shrouded London morning in 1867, the Duke of Ashford's carriage rolled past St. James's Square when a voice pierced the winter air, ragged, desperate, but strangely familiar. The man in tattered clothes stood frozen, his hand extended for charity, his face hidden beneath grime and beard, but when their eyes met, the Duke's blood turned cold. For the beggar spoke only one word, a name no living soul outside the family walls should know, a secret buried with the Duke's late father 20 years prior. That single utterance would unravel everything. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Blackwood Manor, casting geometric patterns across the Persian rugs that adorned the drawing room. Roland Ashford stood before the mirror, adjusting his cravat with practiced precision, his reflection revealing a young man of 26 years, with dark hair carefully pomaded, sharp cheekbones that spoke of aristocratic lineage, and eyes the color of slate that held no joy despite the privilege surrounding him. His valet, Pemberton, hovered nearby with an expression of professional detachment, though Roland sensed the older man's disapproval in the set of his shoulders. Today was meant to be significant, another milestone in the carefully orchestrated life his uncle, the Duke of Ashford, had designed for him since his father's death 2 decades ago. "Your uncle expects you in his study at 9 o'clock precisely," Pemberton murmured, brushing invisible lint from Roland's dark morning coat. "He wishes to discuss the Thornbury arrangements." Roland's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The Thornbury arrangements. How clinical that sounded, as though they were discussing livestock, rather than his impending engagement to Lady Victoria Thornbury, daughter of the Earl of Thornbury, one of the wealthiest and most influential families in England. The match had been decided when Roland was 15 and Victoria barely 13. A strategic alliance between 2 great houses, sealed with contracts and expectations long before either party had developed opinions of their own. He descended the grand staircase, his footsteps muffled by crimson carpeting, passing portraits of Ashford ancestors who stared down with expressions of stern judgment. The manor itself was a testament to generations of accumulated wealth. Marble columns imported from Italy, chandeliers glittering with thousands of crystals, furniture crafted by master artisans. Everything spoke of permanence, of unassailable position in society's highest echelon. Yet Roland felt like a prisoner in this gilded palace. His uncle, Duke Henry Ashford, occupied the study like a monarch upon a throne. At 62, the Duke remained an imposing figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair swept back from a face that seemed carved from granite. His eyes, pale blue and cold as winter ice, fixed upon Roland with an expression that demanded obedience without requiring words. "Sit," the Duke commanded, gesturing to the chair opposite his massive mahogany desk. Roland complied, maintaining the posture of deference his uncle had instilled through years of rigid discipline. The study smelled of leather, tobacco, and old money, scents Roland associated with countless lectures about duty, family honor, and the weight of the Ashford name. "The Thornbury engagement ball is scheduled for Saturday fortnight," the Duke began without preamble, his fingers steepled before him. 200 guests, including members of Parliament, several peers of the realm, and Her Majesty's second cousin. "This is not merely a social occasion, Roland. This is the culmination of years of careful negotiation. The merger of our estates will create one of the largest landholdings in England. Your marriage to Lady Victoria is essential." "I understand, Uncle," Roland replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Do you?" The Duke leaned forward, his gaze penetrating. "I wonder sometimes if you truly comprehend what I have built here, what I have preserved since your father's unfortunate passing. Your father was brilliant but reckless, given to flights of fancy and dangerous associations. He nearly destroyed everything our family had constructed over centuries. When he died, I salvaged the Ashford legacy. I restored our name, and I will not permit you to squander that through sentiment or foolishness." Roland had heard variations of this speech throughout his life, always with the implication that his father had been somehow deficient, somehow unworthy of the Ashford heritage. Yet Roland's memories of his father, fragmented and fading after so many years, were of warmth, laughter, and a man who seemed to find joy in unexpected places. His mother had died giving birth to him, a tragedy his uncle mentioned only to emphasize Roland's obligation to marry well and produce legitimate heirs. "I have arranged everything precisely," the Duke continued, opening a leather portfolio. "Your speech for the engagement announcement, the guest list, even the ring you will present. Your grandmother's ruby, reset in a new design Lady Victoria herself approved. You need only appear, perform your role, and secure our future. And if Lady Victoria and I do not suit each other beyond these arrangements?" Roland asked quietly, knowing the question was futile, but unable to suppress it entirely. The Duke's expression hardened. "Suitability is irrelevant. Marriage among our class is a business arrangement, a strategic alliance. Affection is a luxury afforded to those without responsibilities. You are an Ashford. Your duty supersedes personal inclination. Lady Victoria is beautiful, accomplished, from impeccable lineage, and brings a considerable fortune. What more could any rational man require?" What indeed? Roland thought but did not voice. Perhaps someone who saw him as more than a title and an estate. Perhaps a connection of minds rather than merely a merger of properties. Perhaps the freedom to choose his own path. But such thoughts were dangerous, and Roland had learned long ago to keep them hidden behind a mask of compliance. That afternoon, Roland rode his stallion across the Blackwood estate grounds, seeking temporary escape in motion and solitude. The November wind bit at his face, carrying the scent of wood smoke from tenant cottages, dotting the landscape. The estate stretched across 15,000 acres of rolling countryside, fields, forests, tenant farms, and 3 villages that depended on Ashford patronage. This would all be his one day, when his uncle finally passed on the title. And yet Roland felt no joy at the prospect, only the crushing weight of expectations and a life mapped out in excruciating detail, leaving no room for spontaneity or genuine choice. He had met Lady Victoria Thornbury numerous times at various social functions throughout the years. She was, as his uncle stated, beautiful in the classic sense. Golden hair, porcelain complexion, elegant deportment. She spoke French fluently, played the pianoforte with technical precision, and knew exactly which topics were appropriate for polite conversation. She was, in every measurable way, perfect. She was also entirely disinterested in anything beyond social climbing and maintaining appearances. Their conversations never ventured beyond superficial pleasantries. Roland suspected she viewed him with equal indifference, a necessary component of her own family's ambitions, no more personally significant than the correct silverware at a formal dinner. As darkness fell and Roland returned to the manor, he found his uncle entertaining guests in the main drawing-room. Among them was Lord Stirling Thornbury, Lady Victoria's older brother and heir to the Thornbury title. Stirling was 32, handsome in a cold, calculating way, with fair hair and eyes that assessed everyone he encountered as either useful or disposable. "Ah, Roland!" Stirling called out with false warmth, a crystal tumbler of whiskey in his hand. "I was just telling your uncle about the hunting party we are organizing at Thornbury Hall next month. You must attend. We shall have excellent sport, I assure you." Roland murmured appropriate responses, noting how Stirling's gaze held a hint of condescension, as though he were doing Roland a tremendous favor by permitting him to marry into the Thornbury family. Stirling had a reputation for arrogance and casual cruelty toward those he deemed beneath him. Servants, tenants, anyone lacking sufficient rank or wealth. Yet society celebrated him as a paragon of aristocratic excellence. Later that evening, as Roland prepared for bed, he stood again at his window overlooking the estate grounds. Fog had rolled in from the Thames, obscuring the landscape in grey mist. Somewhere beyond these walls existed a wider world, one where men made their own fortunes and chose their own destinies. But for Roland Ashford, nephew and heir to the Duke of Ashford, that world might as well have been on another continent. The engagement ball loomed before him like a sentence pronounced by fate, irrevocable, inescapable, final. Saturday arrived with merciless inevitability. Thornbury Hall blazed with light, every window illuminated as though the great house were ablaze. Carriages lined the circular drive, depositing London's most distinguished families onto marble steps where liveried footmen stood at attention. The cream of Victorian society had assembled to witness the union of two great houses, the Ashfords and the Thornburys. Roland arrived with his uncle in the ducal carriage, both men dressed in formal evening attire. Black tailcoats, white waistcoats, silk cravats precisely tied. The Duke's expression was one of satisfaction, a rare softening of his usual stern countenance. This was his triumph, the culmination of years of negotiation and planning. "Remember your speech," the Duke murmured as they ascended the steps. "Confidence, brevity, gratitude to Lord Thornbury for his daughter's hand. Nothing extemporaneous." The grand ballroom was a spectacle of Victorian opulence, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across gilded walls, an orchestra positioned in the gallery above, hundreds of guests dressed in their finest silks and jewels. Servants circulated with champagne and delicacies on silver trays. Conversation hummed with the particular quality of the upper classes, carefully modulated voices discussing politics, property, and prestigious connections. Lady Victoria stood near the centre of the room in a gown of ivory silk and Brussels lace, her golden hair arranged in elaborate curls adorned with pearls. She looked every inch the ideal aristocratic bride, and as Roland approached, she extended her gloved hand with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Ashford," she said formally, as though they had not known each other for over a decade. "How pleasant you could attend this evening." The irony of her phrasing, as though he might have declined his own engagement ball, was apparently lost on her. Roland bowed over her hand, performing the ritual as he had been taught. Lord Thornbury called for attention, his commanding voice cutting through the conversational din. The orchestra fell silent. 200 faces turned toward the center of the ballroom, where Roland and Victoria stood, suddenly isolated in a circle of expectant attention. "Distinguished guests, peers of the realm, dear friends," Lord Thornbury began, his chest swelling with self-importance. "We are gathered this evening to celebrate a most advantageous union, the engagement of my beloved daughter, Lady Victoria Thornbury, to Mr. Roland Ashford, nephew and heir to His Grace the Duke of Ashford. This alliance brings together two of England's finest families, joining our estates and our fortunes in a bond that will strengthen both houses for generations to come." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Roland felt the weight of the ruby ring in his pocket, the symbol of commitment he was expected to present. His uncle stood nearby, watching with those cold blue eyes that permitted no deviation from the script. Roland began his prepared speech, words flowing automatically while his mind felt curiously detached. "Lord Thornbury, Lady Thornbury, distinguished guests, I am honored beyond measure by the trust you have placed in me. Lady Victoria is a jewel of the finest quality, and I pledge to—" "Stop!" The single word cut through Roland's speech like a blade. Every head turned towards Sterling Thornbury, who had stepped forward from the crowd. His expression, a mixture of theatrical concern and barely suppressed amusement. "I apologize for the interruption," Sterling announced, though his tone suggested no apology whatsoever. "But I cannot in good conscience allow this farce to continue. I have information that must be shared before my sister binds herself to the Ashford name." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Roland's uncle moved forward, his face darkening. "Lord Thornbury, this is highly irregular." "Irregular, Your Grace?" Sterling interrupted, his voice rising to ensure every guest could hear. Is it irregular to protect one's sister from a fraudulent marriage, to expose the truth about the Ashford legacy? Roland felt ice forming in his chest. What was Sterling suggesting? What could he possibly know about? Roland Ashford is not who he claims to be, Sterling declared, pulling a folded document from his coat. I have here evidence, obtained through considerable effort and expense, proving that Roland's father, the previous Mr. Ashford, engaged in activities that brought shame upon the family name. More significantly, I have documentation suggesting that Roland himself may not be the legitimate heir to the Ashford fortune. The ballroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Roland stood frozen, his mind reeling. His uncle's face had gone pale, then flushed with rage. "This is preposterous," the Duke thundered. "Slanderous lies designed to what, Your Grace? To prevent my sister from marrying into a house built on deception." Sterling's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. He was enjoying this, Roland realized with growing horror. This was not about truth or protecting Victoria. This was calculated cruelty, a power play designed to humiliate and destroy. Victoria had stepped away from Roland as though he carried a contagious disease, her face a mask of shock and revulsion. "Father," she called out plaintively, "is this true? Have we been deceived?" "I assure you, my dear," Lord Thornbury replied, his own expression carefully neutral. He had known. Roland suddenly understood. Father and son had orchestrated this together. "We shall investigate these claims thoroughly. Until then, I cannot possibly allow this engagement to proceed." Roland found his voice at last, though it emerged strained and hollow. "These accusations are baseless. My lineage is documented, verified." "Verified by whom?" Sterling challenged, moving closer with predatory grace. "By your uncle, who had everything to gain from establishing you as heir. I have statements here from servants who claim your father had associations with persons of questionable character, debts, secrets, perhaps even connections that would explain certain irregularities. Each word was carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage without specific enough claims to invite legal challenge. Sterling was destroying Roland's reputation with innuendo and implication, weapons against which there was no effective defense in the court of social opinion. The Duke attempted to restore order, to demand Sterling present his supposed evidence for proper examination, but the damage was irreversible. Guests were already whispering, speculation spreading like wildfire through the assembled crowd. Some faces showed genuine shock, others barely concealed delight at the scandal unfolding before them. Lady Victoria had begun to weep, theatrical tears designed for maximum effect. "How could you?" she directed toward Roland, as though he were the villain in this nightmare. "How could you let me believe we would have a respectable marriage?" Roland wanted to defend himself, to expose Sterling's manipulation. But what could he say? He knew nothing of his father's private affairs, nothing of what might or might not be hidden in the past. His uncle had controlled all information about his father, always speaking of him with contempt and warnings about recklessness. What if there were truths he had never been told? "I believe," Sterling announced with false regret, "that my sister and I must withdraw from this arrangement. Surely everyone understands that the Thornbury reputation cannot be associated with such uncertainty. Come, Victoria." He guided his sister through the parting crowd like a shepherd leading a lamb away from wolves. Victoria cast one final look back at Roland, not with sympathy or regret, but with disdain, as though he was something distasteful she had narrowly avoided stepping in. Lord Thornbury addressed the stunned assembly. "I apologize for this unfortunate disruption. Clearly, there are matters requiring resolution before any union can be considered. I must ask you all to respect my family's privacy during this difficult time. The engagement is formally dissolved." Just like that, in a matter of minutes, Roland's entire future had been obliterated. The guests began to disperse, some approaching the Duke with expressions of false sympathy, others already gossiping behind gloved hands. Roland caught fragments of whispered speculation, always suspected something. Poor Duke, what a burden. The Thornburys are well rid of him. His uncle gripped his arm with bruising force, steering him toward the exit. We are leaving. Now, before this becomes any worse. As they pushed through the crowd toward the entrance, Roland noticed Sterling watching from across the ballroom, a smile of pure triumph on his face. This had been planned, orchestrated for maximum public spectacle. But why? What had Roland or his family done to inspire such targeted malice? The carriage ride back to Blackwood Manor passed in crushing silence. The Duke stared out the window, his jaw working as though grinding stone. Roland felt numb, his mind replaying the scene again and again, the shock, the accusations, the cruel efficiency with which his engagement had been dismantled. As they arrived home, the Duke finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "Pack your things. I want you gone from Blackwood by morning." Roland stared at his uncle in disbelief. "Gone? Uncle, surely we can investigate these claims, prove them false. You do not understand the damage that has been done tonight." The Duke's face was terrible in its controlled fury. "Your name, and by extension mine, has been dragged through the mud before the entire aristocracy. Whether Sterling's accusations are true or false is almost irrelevant. Society has already convicted you. Your presence here now is a liability I cannot afford. But where would I go? I have no independent means, no. That is no longer my concern." The Duke's tone was final, implacable. "You have a small trust left by your mother, enough to survive if you are frugal. Beyond that, you are on your own. The Ashford legacy must be protected, and you have become a threat to that legacy." Roland felt the ground disappearing beneath his feet. In the span of a few hours, he had lost his engagement, his reputation, his home, and his future. The uncle who had raised him was casting him out like refuse. "I will investigate my father's past," Roland said quietly, desperately. "I will prove Sterling's accusations false and restore my name." The Duke laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You are naive. Sterling Thornbury has no evidence because he needs none. He has only planted doubt, and doubt is more destructive than any proven fact. Now leave my sight. I cannot bear to look at you." Roland climbed the stairs to his room one final time, each step heavier than the last. The manor that had been his prison now expelled him into a world for which he was entirely unprepared. He had no profession, no practical skills, only a gentleman's education designed for managing estates and making polite conversation. As he gathered his few personal possessions, some clothes, a miniature portrait of his mother, his father's pocket watch, Roland caught his reflection in the mirror. The same face, the same features, yet he looked utterly transformed. The comfortable complacency was gone, replaced by something raw and uncertain. Dawn found Roland walking down the manor drive with a single travelling case, leaving behind the only life he had ever known. Fog obscured the landscape, swallowing Blackwood Manor as though it had never existed. His mother's trust would provide a modest income, enough perhaps for simple lodgings and basic necessities, but nothing approaching the lifestyle he had been raised to expect. He had fallen from the golden cage into the cold reality beyond, and he had no idea how to survive what came next. 3 months had reduced Roland Ashford from aristocratic heir to something unrecognizable. He now occupied a cramped room in a shabby lodging house near King's Cross, a neighborhood where respectability went to die. The narrow bed sagged in the middle, the washbasin chipped and stained, the single window offering a view of sooty brick and hanging laundry. The sounds of London's working poor surrounded him. Children crying, couples arguing, the constant rattle of carts over cobblestones. His mother's trust provided exactly £4 per month, barely enough for rent, food and coal for the meagre fireplace. Roland had sold most of his fine clothing, keeping only one decent suit for purposes he could not yet articulate. He had no profession, no connections willing to acknowledge him after the scandal, and no prospects. For the first month, he had pursued vindication obsessively, seeking anyone who might provide information about his father or Sterling's supposed evidence. He had written letters to family solicitors, to distant relatives, to anyone who might assist him. Every letter went unanswered. Society had rendered its verdict, and Roland Ashford was guilty simply because the accusation had been made. By the second month, despair had settled in like fog. He spent days walking London streets, observing a world he had never truly seen before. Street vendors hawking chestnuts and meat pies, mudlarks searching the Thames at low tide for anything salvageable, factory workers trudging home with exhausted faces, beggars on every corner, their hands extended in perpetual supplication. He was becoming one of them. The realization struck him one morning as he stood before his cracked mirror, noting how his clothes hung loose on his frame, how his face had thinned from inadequate nutrition, how his hands, once smooth and cared for, now bore calluses from chopping his own firewood. He looked like what he was becoming, desperate, forgotten, invisible. That afternoon, Roland walked aimlessly through Bloomsbury, his stomach cramping with hunger. He had 3 shillings remaining until his monthly allowance arrived, still 2 weeks distant. 3 shillings for food, fuel, everything. The mathematics were cruel and unforgiving. He found himself on a street corner watching wealthy carriages pass, their occupants wrapped in furs and complacency. Some part of him recognized the absurd reversal. He who had been carried through London in a duke's carriage now stood on the pavement like any common beggar. "Spare a coin for an old soldier, sir." A ragged man with a wooden leg stood nearby, his palm extended hopefully toward passers-by, who uniformly ignored him. "Served Her Majesty at Sebastopol, I did. Lost me leg for crown and country." Roland had nothing to give, but he stood watching the man's futile appeals with a strange fascination. This was survival on the streets. Constant appeal to the charity of those who mostly felt none. How long before Roland himself stood with an extended hand, begging for shillings to purchase another day? "You look troubled, young man." Roland turned to find an elderly woman regarding him with shrewd, not unkind eyes. She was perhaps 70, dressed in black bombazine that had seen better days, but remained clean and well-maintained. Her silver hair was arranged neatly beneath a modest bonnet, and she carried herself with a dignity that poverty had not quite extinguished. "I apologize," Roland said automatically, starting to move away. "No apology necessary. I am Mrs. Agatha Pembroke, and I make it my business to notice those who seem lost in this great, indifferent city." She tilted her head, studying him. "You were not born to these circumstances. I can see it in your posture, hear it in your speech. Yet here you stand, contemplating that poor veteran with the expression of one who sees his own future." Roland felt stripped naked by her perception. "I have no idea what you mean. Do not compound your troubles with dishonesty, young man. I have lived too long to be deceived by polite deflection." He gestured toward a small tea shop across the street. "Come. Allow me to purchase you a cup of tea and a sandwich. You look as though you need both, and I have questions that your pride may permit you to answer over food." Pride should have driven Roland away, but hunger and desperate loneliness proved stronger. He followed Mrs. Pembroke into the modest establishment, where she ordered with the authority of a regular patron. Soon, Roland found himself consuming tea and a beef sandwich with an urgency that betrayed his circumstances. "Now," Mrs. Pembroke said, once his immediate hunger had been addressed, "tell me your story. I shall not judge, and I may even be able to help." Something in her voice, a genuine interest without the condescension he had encountered elsewhere, unlocked Roland's carefully maintained reserve. He told her everything. His upbringing as heir to the Ashford fortune, the arranged engagement, Sterling's public accusations, his uncle's banishment, the months of fruitless attempts at vindication. He spoke without self-pity, simply narrating facts, yet the cumulative weight of his fall was evident in every sentence. Mrs. Pembroke listened without interruption, her intelligent eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, sipping her tea thoughtfully. "You have been treated abominably," she finally said, "but I suspect you already know that. The question is what you intend to do now. Will you continue pursuing vindication from people who have already decided your guilt, or will you forge a new path entirely?" "What new path?" Roland asked bitterly. "I have no profession, no trade skills, no connections beyond those who have rejected me. I'm slowly starving on £4 monthly, watching my life drain away into nothing." "You have more than you recognize," Mrs. Pembroke countered. "You are educated, articulate, and young enough to learn. Moreover, you now possess something you lacked when you lived in that golden cage, freedom. The expectations that bound you have been severed. You can become whoever you choose to be." Roland wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but something in her words caught his attention. Freedom. He had never considered his fall in those terms. He had only mourned what he had lost, never considering what he might gain. "I have a proposition," Mrs. Pembroke continued. "I run a small charitable organization in Bloomsbury, a reading room and educational society for those who wish to better themselves. We teach reading, writing, basic mathematics, and practical skills to working-class adults who were denied proper education. We also host lectures on various topics. I need an assistant teacher, someone who can tutor individuals and help with administrative matters. The pay is modest, £2 weekly, but it includes a small apartment above the reading room, far more pleasant than your current lodgings. £2 weekly, £8 monthly, double his current income, plus accommodation." It seemed impossibly generous, yet Roland's gentleman's training made him hesitate. Teaching common labourers. His uncle would have been apoplectic at the very suggestion. Then again, his uncle had banished him. Society had rejected him. What did their opinions matter now? "Why would you offer this to a stranger?" Roland asked cautiously. "You know nothing of my character beyond my own account." Mrs. Pembroke smiled, an expression that transformed her austere features. "I know you did not steal this sandwich, despite obvious hunger, until I offered to purchase it. I know you speak honestly about your circumstances rather than inventing flattering falsehoods. And I know something else. I knew your father." Roland felt as though the floor had shifted beneath him. "You knew my father?" "Edmund Ashford, yes. He was a patron of our society before his death. He believed passionately in education for all classes, in breaking down barriers between those born to privilege and those denied it. Your uncle likely never mentioned Edmund's charitable work because he considered it scandalous, consorting with the lower classes, wasting resources on the undeserving poor. But Edmund was one of the finest men I have known." Tears burned unexpectedly in Roland's eyes. His father had been real, had cared about something beyond estate management and social position. The uncle who had raised him had erased this entire dimension of Edmund Ashford's life, leaving only contempt and warnings about recklessness. "If you are Edmund's son," Mrs. Pembroke said gently, "then I have faith you possess his qualities. Will you accept my offer? Will you help me continue the work your father believed in?" Roland nodded, unable to trust his voice. For the first time in 3 months, he felt something other than despair. A fragile, tentative hope that perhaps his life was not over, but merely transforming into something unexpected. The Bloomsbury Reading Society occupied a converted townhouse on a quiet street lined with plane trees. The ground floor housed a library of donated books, mismatched shelves crammed with volumes ranging from basic primers to works of literature and science. Long tables accommodated students of all ages, dock workers learning to read contracts, seamstresses studying mathematics, young men preparing for civil service examinations. Mrs. Pembroke introduced Roland to the volunteers and regular students with simple efficiency. "This is Roland. He will be assisting with tutoring and administrative matters. Please make him welcome." There was no mention of titles, scandal, or fallen aristocrats. Here, Roland was simply Roland, judged by his contribution rather than his pedigree. The apartment above the reading room was small but clean. One room with a proper bed, desk, washstand, and a window overlooking the street. After his King's Cross lodgings, it seemed palatial. Roland began his work cautiously, uncertain of his abilities. His education had been classical and largely ornamental: Latin, Greek, philosophy, literature. He had never considered how one taught someone to decode written words or calculate basic sums. But his students proved patient with his inexperience, and Roland discovered an unexpected aptitude for explanation. He worked with James, a bricklayer of 40 who had never learned to read and was determined to understand the Bible himself rather than relying on others' interpretation. He tutored Sarah, a young widow who needed mathematics to run the small shop she had inherited from her husband. He helped Thomas, a railway clerk, prepare for an examination that might lead to promotion. Each student carried a story, a life of labor and struggle that humbled Roland's own troubles. They worked exhausting hours at dangerous jobs, lived in overcrowded conditions, and still sought improvement through education. Their determination and dignity challenged every assumption Roland had absorbed about class and worthiness. Weeks passed in a rhythm of teaching, studying, and gradual transformation. Roland began borrowing books from the library, not classical literature, but practical works on science, economics, social reform. He attended lectures that Mrs. Pembroke organized, where speakers addressed topics ranging from public health to voting rights to factory conditions. At one such lecture, Roland encountered someone who would alter his trajectory once more. Dr. Elias Reid was 35, a physician who ran a clinic in the East End, serving London's poorest residents. He spoke that evening about the connection between poverty and disease, arguing passionately for social reforms that would improve living conditions for the working class. He was tall, lean, with dark hair touched with grey at the temples and eyes that burned with conviction. After the lecture, attendees gathered for tea and discussion. Roland found himself drawn into conversation with Dr. Reid, initially intending only to ask a question about public health policy. But their discussion expanded, touching on everything from scientific method to moral philosophy to the proper role of government in addressing inequality. "You have an analytical mind," Dr. Reid observed, studying Roland with interest. "Have you considered medical training? We desperately need doctors willing to serve populations that cannot afford Harley Street fees." Roland laughed, though not unkindly. "I lack the means for medical school, and my background is entirely unsuited for such work." "Background?" Dr. Reid's eyebrow arched. "I care nothing for background. I care about aptitude and commitment. Come observe my clinic one day, see the work we do. Then tell me whether your background matters to a child dying of typhoid." The challenge in his voice was impossible to ignore. 2 days later, Roland stood in Dr. Reid's clinic, 2 converted rooms in a decrepit building where humanity's suffering presented itself in overwhelming waves. Mothers with sick children, laborers with infected wounds, elderly patients with chronic ailments they could never afford to treat properly. Dr. Reid moved among them with tireless efficiency, treating, comforting, organizing care with limited resources. Roland assisted in small ways, fetching supplies, cleaning instruments, comforting frightened children. The work was exhausting and heartbreaking, yet at day's end, Roland felt more alive than he had in months. This was purpose, not merely existence. "You did well," Dr. Reid said as they closed the clinic. "Better than most who encounter such conditions for the first time. Would you consider volunteering regularly? I could teach you basic medical care. You would be useful, and you might discover a vocation." Roland agreed without hesitation. Over the following weeks, he divided his time between the Reading Society and Dr. Reid's clinic, learning to clean wounds, recognize symptoms, comfort the dying. It was brutal education in humanity's suffering, but also in resilience and courage. His conversations with Dr. Reid expanded beyond medicine. Elias, as he insisted Roland call him, possessed a brilliant mind and a passion for reform that reminded Roland of what Mrs. Pembroke had said about his father. Elias believed in using science and reason to improve society, in breaking down class barriers that prevented collective progress. "You are not what I expected when we first met," Elias said one evening as they walked home from the clinic. "There is something in your manner that suggests you came from privilege, yet you work alongside the poor without condescension. What is your story, Roland?" Roland hesitated, then found himself sharing an abbreviated version of his history. He mentioned falling from society, but omitted specific names and details. Elias listened without judgment. Society's cruelty often reveals society's failures, not the individuals, Elias observed. You have been given an opportunity many never receive, to see life from multiple perspectives. Use it, learn from it, become someone who builds bridges between worlds that normally never meet. And as winter turned to early spring, Roland realized he had not thought about vindication or returning to his former life in weeks. He was too busy teaching, learning medicine, engaging with ideas that challenged everything he had been taught about the proper order of the world. He had friends, genuine friends, not merely social acquaintances, in Mrs. Pembroke, Elias and his students. One evening, as he sat at his desk writing a letter to a medical supply company on behalf of Elias's clinic, Roland caught his reflection in the window glass. He looked different, leaner, harder, more defined by purpose than privilege. The soft, complacent young man who had stood in Thornbury Hall months ago had been burned away, replaced by someone he barely recognized but was beginning to respect. He thought occasionally of Sterling Thornbury and Lady Victoria, wondered if they were satisfied with their cruelty. But the rage he had initially felt had transformed into something closer to pity. They remained trapped in the golden cage, prisoners of social expectations and empty ambitions. Roland had been freed, however brutally, to discover what actually mattered. He did not yet know where his new path would lead, but for the first time in his life, Roland Ashford was choosing his own direction. That freedom, he was beginning to understand, was worth more than any title or estate. 9 months after his banishment, Roland stood before the doors of the Royal Society for Social Reform, checking his reflection in the polished brass plate one final time. He wore his one good suit, carefully maintained, his hair trimmed and face clean-shaven. Behind him, Mrs. Pembroke adjusted his collar with the satisfied expression of a general preparing troops for battle. "You look distinguished," she pronounced. "Now remember, speak from conviction, not anger. Present facts, not grievances. This is your opportunity to demonstrate what you have become." The Royal Society's annual symposium drew London's intellectual elite, progressive aristocrats, reform-minded politicians, and influential journalists. Mrs. Pembroke had secured Roland a place as a speaker on the panel discussing public health and education for the poor, a minor role, but his first appearance before society since his fall. Dr. Reed waited inside, his presence a source of both support and nervous energy for Roland. Over the past months, their friendship had deepened into something Roland did not yet have words for. Elias saw him, truly saw him, in ways no one in his previous life ever had. He challenged Roland's thinking, encouraged his growth, and treated him as an intellectual equal rather than a title or scandal. "You will do brilliantly," Elias said quietly, his hand briefly touching Roland's shoulder. "You have lived the transformation you will describe. That authenticity will be evident." The symposium hall was elegant, oak paneling, gaslight sconces, rows of velvet-upholstered chairs filled with 200 distinguished attendees. Roland scanned the crowd from backstage, his stomach churning. He recognized faces from his previous life, people who had attended his disastrous engagement ball, who had whispered about his disgrace. Then he saw them. Sterling Thornbury sat in the third row, Lady Victoria beside him, both dressed with the careless wealth Roland had once taken for granted. Sterling's expression was one of amused curiosity, as though he had attended specifically to witness Roland's humiliation in this new arena. Victoria looked bored, fanning herself with practiced indifference. Roland's first instinct was panic, a desire to flee before they could mock him again. But then Elias's steadying presence materialized at his elbow. "Who are they?" Elias asked, having noticed Roland's reaction. "The man and woman who destroyed my previous life," Roland admitted quietly. "Sterling and Victoria Thornbury." Elias studied them for a moment, then smiled, a sharp, knowing expression. "Then let them witness what you have built from those ruins. Show them that their cruelty only revealed your strength." The panel began with opening remarks from Lord Ashton, a progressive peer who supported legislative reforms for the working poor. Then came presentations on factory conditions, housing reform, and educational access. Finally, Roland was introduced to speak about the Bloomsbury Reading Society's work and his experiences at Dr. Reed's clinic. He walked to the podium, acutely aware of every eye upon him, particularly those cold, amused eyes in the third row. For a moment, his prepared notes seemed to blur, his carefully rehearsed words evaporating. Then he thought of James the bricklayer, finally able to read the Bible to his grandchildren, of Sarah the widow, successfully managing her shop's accounts, of the child at Elias's clinic who had survived typhoid because they had caught it early enough. Roland began to speak. "9 months ago, I believed I understood society's structure. I believed those born to privilege were inherently superior, that the poor suffered primarily due to their own deficiencies, that charity was sufficient to address inequality." His voice grew stronger, steadier. "I was catastrophically wrong." He described his work at the Reading Society, the students he had taught, their determination despite overwhelming obstacles. He spoke of the clinic, of preventable diseases killing children whose parents could not afford doctors. He presented data on literacy rates, mortality statistics, the economic cost of maintaining an undereducated, unhealthy working class. But more than statistics, Roland spoke of specific people, giving names and stories to abstractions. He made the audience see James, Sarah, Thomas. He made them understand that intelligence and worthiness bore no relationship to birth circumstances. "I once thought education was a privilege reserved for those who could afford it," Roland said, his gaze sweeping the audience, deliberately including Sterling in his line of sight. "I now understand it is a right that we deny at our collective peril. An educated populace strengthens the entire nation. A healthy working class benefits everyone, not merely through economic productivity, but through the expansion of human potential currently being squandered." He could see reactions rippling through the crowd, some nodding in agreement, others looking uncomfortable as their assumptions were challenged. Sterling's amused expression had faded, replaced by something harder to read. Victoria was actually paying attention, her fan lowered. Roland concluded with a call for legislative reforms, publicly funded schools, workplace safety regulations, accessible healthcare. He cited successful models from Germany and France, demonstrated the economic arguments alongside moral imperatives. When he finished, the applause was substantial, genuine. Several audience members stood, including Elias, whose expression communicated pride and something deeper that made Roland's heart race. The question period brought both support and challenges. An industrialist questioned the cost of proposed reforms. Roland countered with data on productivity gains from educated, healthy workers. A conservative peer suggested Roland's views were dangerously radical. Roland calmly pointed out that preventing revolution through reform was hardly radical, but rather prudent. Then Sterling Thornbury stood. "Mr. Ashford," he called out, his voice carrying clearly, "you speak eloquently about education and social reform. Yet I wonder if the audience is aware of your background, that you yourself were once part of the privileged class you now critique, that you have personal reasons for advocating the overthrow of social hierarchies." The hall fell silent. Roland felt the familiar ice forming in his chest. Sterling was attempting to undermine his credibility by exposing his origins and scandal, but Roland had anticipated this possibility. Mrs. Pembroke had warned him it might come. "Lord Thornbury," Roland replied, keeping his voice level, You are quite correct. I was indeed raised in privilege, educated in the most exclusive institutions, groomed for a position among society's elite. That experience gives me unique perspective on the system I critique. I have seen firsthand how privilege can create complacency, how isolation from the struggles of others can generate contempt disguised as paternalism. He paused, meeting Sterling's gaze directly. I have also experienced how quickly society discards those who no longer serve its purposes. I was cast out based on unproven accusations, denied any opportunity to defend myself, and left to survive on my own. That experience taught me far more than my privileged education ever did. It taught me about resilience, about the arbitrary cruelty of social hierarchies, and about the extraordinary courage of people who face such challenges daily without ever having known privilege to lose. The audience stirred, some whispering. Roland continued before Sterling could respond. You suggest my advocacy is motivated by personal grievance. I suggest it is informed by personal experience that most reformers lack. I have lived on both sides of the divide we discussed today. That perspective is valuable, not disqualifying. Several people applauded. Sterling's face had flushed slightly, his attempt to embarrass Roland having instead generated sympathy. Victoria was staring at Roland with an expression he could not quite interpret, surprise, perhaps, or reassessment. Furthermore, Roland added, deciding to press his advantage, I note that Lord Thornbury himself is among the privileged elite. His presence here suggests even he recognizes the need to address social inequalities, unless, of course, he attended merely to undermine speakers, rather than engage substantively with ideas. That drew scattered laughter. Sterling sat down abruptly, his expression thunderous. Roland had turned the confrontation to his advantage, something the old Roland, the compliant, controlled version, would never have dared attempt. After the symposium concluded, Roland found himself surrounded by attendees eager to discuss his presentation. Journalists requested interviews. Several wealthy philanthropists expressed interest in supporting the Reading Society or Elias's clinic. A publisher suggested Roland write a pamphlet expanding his arguments. Through the crowd, Roland caught glimpses of Sterling and Victoria preparing to leave. Sterling looked furious, his pride clearly wounded by public defeat. But Victoria paused at the door, turning back to look at Roland one last time. Her expression was complex. Regret, perhaps, or merely curiosity about the man she had so easily dismissed 9 months earlier. Then they were gone, and Roland found he felt nothing toward them. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not even anger. They had become irrelevant to his life, relics of a past that no longer defined him. Elias appeared through the crowd, his eyes bright with emotion. You were magnificent, he said quietly. Everything I knew you could be. I nearly panicked when I saw them, Roland admitted. If you had not steadied me. You steadied yourself, Elias interrupted. I merely reminded you of what you had already learned. Roland, you have transformed yourself so completely that those people no longer have power over you. Can you see that? Roland nodded slowly, the truth of it settling into his bones. He was not the man Sterling had destroyed at Thornbury Hall. That person had been a hollow construct, defined entirely by external expectations. The man Roland was becoming had substance, purpose, agency. Come, Elias said, taking Roland's arm in a gesture that seemed to communicate multiple meanings simultaneously. Mrs. Pembroke is hosting a celebration dinner at her home. She has invited some of the reformers you impressed today. It is time to discuss how we transform your words into action. As they walked out into the London evening, fog beginning to gather in familiar patterns, Roland felt the weight of possibility rather than obligation. He had re-emerged into public life not as an aristocratic heir, but as an advocate for change. He had confronted his past and found it lacking any real power to hurt him. And he had done it alongside people who valued him for who he was becoming, not who he had been born to be. That, Roland was beginning to understand, was the truest form of freedom. to be seen and valued for one's choices rather than one's circumstances. The path ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time, that uncertainty felt like adventure rather than doom. The autumn light slanted through the windows of the expanded Bloomsbury Reading Society, illuminating rows of students bent over their work. The society had grown substantially in the 6 months since Roland's symposium speech. More volunteers, more students, and thanks to donations from impressed philanthropists, 3 additional rooms and a proper library catalogue. Roland moved through the space with the comfortable authority of someone who had found his place. He was consulting with a new student when Mrs. Pembroke appeared at his elbow, her expression suggesting news of significance. "You have a visitor," she murmured, "in the private office. I think you should see him." Curious and slightly apprehensive, Roland made his way to the small office at the back of the building. The man waiting there was in his 60s, neatly dressed in professional attire, with silver hair and a familiar bearing that took Roland a moment to place. "Mr. Patterson?" Roland said in surprise, recognizing his family's former solicitor. "I did not expect to see you." Henry Patterson stood, extending his hand with visible relief. "Mr. Ashford, I am glad I found you. Your whereabouts have been somewhat difficult to ascertain." "That was rather intentional," Roland replied carefully. "What brings you here?" Patterson withdrew a sealed envelope from his coat. "I have information that I should have provided months ago, but was prevented from doing so by your uncle's explicit instructions. However, recent events have released me from those constraints. Your uncle, the Duke of Ashford, passed away 3 weeks ago. Heart failure. You are now the rightful Duke." Roland stood frozen, the words seeming to come from a great distance. His uncle dead. Himself the Duke. The title, the estates, everything he had been banished from now legally his. "I see," he managed. "That is unexpected news." "There is more," Patterson continued, opening the envelope. "Before his death, your uncle made a deathbed confession to the family priest, who felt obligated to inform me as executor of the estate. The accusations Sterling Thornbury made about your father and your legitimacy were entirely false. Your uncle knew they were false because he himself had provided Sterling with the supposed evidence." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Roland's feet. "My uncle orchestrated my disgrace?" Patterson nodded gravely. "He did so because he had discovered you were corresponding with reformist political circles, expressing sympathy for working-class movements. He feared you would squander the Ashford fortune on charitable endeavors and radical causes, exactly as your father had begun to do before his death. The Duke decided it would be better to discredit you entirely, marry you to someone who would control your impulses, and failing that, remove you from the succession." Roland sank into the nearest chair, his mind reeling. Sterling had been cruel, yes, but he had been a weapon wielded by someone closer, by the man who had raised Roland, who had claimed to protect the family legacy. "Sterling Thornbury was complicit?" Roland asked. "Sterling approached your uncle after learning of your engagement to his sister," Patterson explained. "He wanted to prevent the marriage because he coveted Lady Victoria for a wealthier match, the heir to a shipping fortune. Your uncle and Sterling made an arrangement. Sterling would publicly disgrace you. Your uncle would cast you out, and Sterling would be free to pursue his preferred match for his sister. Both men achieved their objectives." "And my father?" Roland's voice was hoarse. "What truth is there about him?" Patterson's expression softened. "Your father was everything your uncle claimed to despise. Generous, idealistic, committed to using his wealth to improve society. He established schools, funded medical clinics, supported labor organizations. Your uncle viewed these activities as dangerous radicalism. When your father died suddenly, and I should note, there were always questions about whether that death was entirely natural. Your uncle systematically erased all evidence of Edmund Ashford's charitable work and reformist sympathies. The room felt too small, the air too thin. Roland's entire understanding of his history was dissolving and reforming. His father had not been reckless or shameful. He had been exactly what Roland himself was becoming, and his uncle had not been a stern protector, but a calculating manipulator who had orchestrated Roland's destruction to preserve his own vision of propriety. "There is a legal matter," Patterson continued. "Your uncle's confession, witnessed by the priest, combined with documentation I have preserved, provides grounds to demand Sterling Thornbury issue a public retraction of his accusations. You could sue for damages. You could force him to acknowledge his role in the conspiracy." Roland looked up sharply. "What would that achieve?" "Complete restoration of your reputation," Patterson said, as though this were obvious. "Acknowledgement by all of society that the accusations were false, orchestrated. Your return to your rightful place among the aristocracy. Sterling Thornbury's social destruction in recompense for what he did to you." Roland stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where working-class Londoners went about their daily struggles. From this office, he could see the clinic where Elias was undoubtedly treating patients at this moment. He could hear the voices of students in the next room, laboring to better themselves against overwhelming odds. "No," he said finally. Patterson blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I do not want revenge on Sterling Thornbury," Roland clarified. "Nor do I want restoration to society on those terms. If I return as the Duke of Ashford, I will do so on my own terms, to pursue my own purposes. But surely you want vindication, acknowledgement that you were wronged." "What I want," Roland interrupted gently, "is to continue the work my father began. If I inherit the Ashford estates, I will use that wealth as he intended, to fund education, healthcare, and reforms that improve lives rather than simply maintain aristocratic comfort. I will vindicate myself through action, not litigation." Patterson looked bewildered but nodded slowly. "It is your decision, Your Grace." The title sounded strange applied to Roland. He was now a duke, one of the most elevated positions in British society, yet he stood in a converted townhouse, teaching labourers to read. The incongruity would have been comical if it were not so laden with meaning. "Give me a few days to consider how to proceed," Roland said. "In the meantime, please do not announce my identity or my uncle's death publicly. I need to make arrangements, have some difficult conversations." After Patterson departed, Roland sat alone in the office for a long while, processing the revelations. His uncle had betrayed him thoroughly, yet Roland found he felt no rage, only a cold understanding of the man's fear and limitations. The Duke had seen Roland developing ideals that challenged the established order and had chosen to destroy his nephew rather than allow those ideals to flourish. That evening, Roland met Elias at their usual coffee house, a modest establishment where intellectuals and reformers gathered to debate politics and philosophy. Roland had delayed this conversation, uncertain how to navigate the complexities, but recent events demanded honesty. "I have something to tell you," Roland began, then explained everything, his true identity as the Duke's heir, the conspiracy that had caused his fall, his uncle's death, the inheritance now available to him. Elias listened without interruption, his expression difficult to read. When Roland finished, a heavy silence stretched between them. "So, you are a duke now," Elias finally said, "with estates and wealth and all the privileges of the highest aristocracy." "Technically, yes," Roland admitted. "But that does not change who I am, or what I want to do with my life. Does it not?" Elias's tone was careful, guarded. "You have the option now to return to your previous world, to reclaim everything you lost. Why would you choose to remain in Bloomsbury, teaching reading classes and working in a charity clinic?" Roland heard the unspoken fear beneath the question, that Roland would leave, that their friendship and whatever deeper connection had been developing between them would be abandoned when privilege beckoned. "Because that previous world was a cage," Roland said quietly. "Because the work we do here matters more than any title. Because I discovered who I actually am in this life, not in the one that was designed for me." He hesitated, then added, "And because you are here." Elias met his gaze, something vulnerable and hopeful flickering in his eyes. "What does that mean?" It means, Roland said carefully, aware they were treading dangerous ground in a society that did not acknowledge the feelings he was trying to articulate, that you have become the most important person in my life, that I cannot imagine pursuing any path that does not include our partnership, that I would choose this work and your companionship over any privilege or title. The words hung between them, weighted with implications neither dared speak more explicitly in a public establishment. But understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of connection deeper than friendship, more significant than any socially sanctioned relationship. "Then what will you do?" Elias asked quietly. "You cannot simply ignore your inheritance." "No," Roland agreed, "but I can use it as my father intended. I will establish the Ashford Foundation for Social Reform. We will fund education initiatives, medical clinics in underserved areas, housing improvements for the poor. We will employ the estate's wealth to create actual change rather than merely maintaining aristocratic privilege." "We?" Elias repeated, the beginning of a smile touching his lips. "If you will partner with me," Roland said. "I need someone with medical expertise to direct healthcare initiatives, someone who understands the communities we aim to serve. I need someone whose judgment I trust completely to ensure the Foundation's work remains genuine rather than performative charity." "You need a partner," Elias said simply. "Yes," Roland acknowledged, the word carrying multiple meanings, "in every sense that society will permit, and perhaps some it will not." Tishtu, they sat together as evening deepened into night, planning the Foundation's structure, identifying priorities, imagining the scale of change they might achieve with substantial resources directed by genuine commitment. Around them, the coffeehouse's usual debates swirled. Arguments about parliamentary reforms, discussions of labor movements, passionate advocacy for women's suffrage. Roland felt he had finally found his place in the world, not despite his title, but in defiance of its traditional expectations. He would be Duke of Ashford, yes, but he would redefine what that title meant. 2 weeks later, Roland stood in Thornbury Hall's drawing room, having requested a private meeting with Sterling and Victoria. They had agreed, curiosity apparently overcoming their contempt. Sterling greeted him with false warmth. "Mr. Ashford, or should I say, Your Grace, word has reached us of your changed circumstances. How unexpected that your uncle should pass so conveniently." Roland ignored the implication. "I came to inform you both directly of something you will learn soon enough through official channels. I know the accusations you made were false, orchestrated in conspiracy with my late uncle. I have documentation and witnesses that could destroy your reputation and result in substantial legal penalties." Victoria's face paled. Sterling's expression flickered between fear and defiance. "However," Roland continued calmly, "I am not pursuing litigation or public exposure, not because you deserve mercy, but because revenge would accomplish nothing useful. I have more important priorities than punishing people whose opinions I no longer value." "How magnanimous," Sterling sneered, though his relief was evident. "You have the power to destroy me, yet you choose not to." "Should I be grateful?" "I do not care whether you are grateful," Roland replied. "But I do want you to understand something. The conspiracy you participated in freed me from a life that would have made me miserable. You thought you were destroying me. Instead, you enabled me to discover my actual purpose. So in a strange way, I am grateful to you, though not for the reasons you would imagine." Victoria spoke for the first time, her voice tentative. "What will you do now?" "I will use my inheritance to continue the social reform work you witnessed at the symposium," Roland said. "I will fund education and healthcare initiatives for the poor. I will advocate for policies that challenge the system that elevated us and oppresses millions. I will become precisely the kind of radical reformer my uncle feared. You will make yourself a pariah among your own class," Sterling predicted. "Among some, perhaps," Roland agreed. "Among others, I hope to inspire change. Regardless, I no longer define myself by aristocratic approval. I found something more valuable in my exile: Genuine purpose and meaningful connection, that is worth more than any social position you could threaten. He turned to leave, then paused. One final thing. Lady Victoria, I hope you find a marriage based on actual compatibility rather than strategic advantage. You deserve that opportunity, despite everything. And Lord Thornbury, I hope you eventually discover that cruelty is not strength, and that destroying others to elevate yourself is the mark of profound insecurity, not superiority. Roland left Thornbury Hall with a sense of closure, not triumph. They had lost their power to hurt him, but he took no joy in that. He simply no longer cared enough about their opinions to let them occupy space in his thoughts. His new life awaited, challenging, uncertain, but finally his own. The gardens of Ashford House in Bloomsbury stretched behind the townhouse in carefully cultivated abundance. Herbs for the clinic, vegetables for the Reading Society's kitchen where students received meals, flowering plants that brought beauty to a neighborhood usually dominated by soot and industry. It was spring now, 14 months since Roland's public disgrace, 8 months since he had claimed his inheritance and fundamentally restructured his life. Roland worked alongside Thomas, his former student who now served as the Foundation's assistant administrator. They were planting tomato seedlings while discussing plans for the new medical college the Foundation would fund, an institution that would train doctors specifically to serve working-class communities, charging no tuition for students committed to that mission. Dr. Reed believes we can admit the first class by autumn if the building renovations proceed on schedule, Thomas reported, his accent still thick, but his confidence transformed from the hesitant bricklayer who had struggled to read a year ago. We have 200 applications already. The demand is extraordinary. Elias has been planning this for years, Roland said, the casual use of his partner's first name natural now. Having resources to implement those plans is merely accelerating what he would have accomplished eventually through sheer determination. The Ashford Foundation for Social Reform had become, in remarkably short order, one of London's most significant charitable enterprises. Roland had sold the ostentatious Blackwood Manor and most of the estate's decorative valuables, converting assets into functional capital. The foundation now operated 12 reading societies across London, 4 medical clinics, 2 vocational training centres, and was establishing the medical college alongside a teachers' training institute. Society's response had been predictably mixed. Progressive aristocrats and intellectuals celebrated Roland's work. Conservative peers considered him a traitor to his class. The popular press alternately lauded him as a reforming hero and criticized him as a dangerous radical. Roland found he cared remarkably little about any of these opinions. What mattered were results: literacy rates improving in neighborhoods they served, mortality rates declining where their clinics operated, former students finding employment previously unavailable to them. What mattered was translating his father's vision into measurable change. "Your Grace," Mrs. Pembroke called from the townhouse doorway, "you have visitors. Journalists from the Manchester Guardian, here for the interview you scheduled." Roland wiped dirt from his hands and headed inside, exchanging his gardening clothes for presentable attire. He had become adept at managing press relations, using interviews to advocate for legislative reforms and encourage other wealthy individuals to redirect their resources towards social improvement. The interview proceeded smoothly. Questions about the Foundation's work, his philosophy of reform, his views on proposed education bills in Parliament. Near the end, the senior journalist leaned forward with obvious interest. "Your Grace, there have been rumors about your personal situation. You live here in Bloomsbury rather than in a ducal mansion. You work directly alongside common labourers. And you share this residence with Dr. Elias Reed, correct? Some find this arrangement unusual for an unmarried duke." Roland had anticipated this line of inquiry. Society's tolerance for his reform work did not extend to acceptance of the deeper truth about his relationship with Elias. They maintained careful propriety in public. professional partnership, close friendship, nothing that could be definitively labeled scandalous. But they lived together, worked together, built their lives around shared purpose and private affection that could never be publicly acknowledged. Dr. Reed directs the Foundation's medical initiatives, Roland replied calmly. Our collaboration requires close coordination. As for my living situation, I choose to reside where our work is centered rather than in isolated aristocratic luxury. I learned during my time away from privilege that proximity to the communities we serve improves our effectiveness and maintains genuine understanding of their needs. The journalist nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation, or at least aware that pressing further would be socially inappropriate. After they departed, Roland found Elias in his study, reviewing applications to the medical college. They asked about us, Roland said, settling into the chair beside Elias's desk. I assumed they would eventually, Elias replied, without looking up from his papers. Does it trouble you? No, Roland said honestly. Let them wonder and whisper. We know what we are to each other, and that is sufficient. Elias finally looked up, his expression soft with affection. You have changed so much from the man I met at that symposium, though perhaps not changed. Perhaps you simply became who you were, always meant to be, once the constraints were removed. I think about that sometimes, Roland mused. If Sterling had not conspired with my uncle, if I had married Victoria and lived out the life designed for me, I would never have discovered any of this. I would have been comfortable, respectable, and absolutely hollow. Their cruelty, paradoxically, was the greatest gift I could have received. Does that mean you have forgiven them? Roland considered. I have released them from significance in my life. Whether that constitutes forgiveness, I am uncertain. But I am grateful for where their actions led me. To this work, to Mrs. Pembroke, to you. I would not trade what I have now for any amount of uncomplicated privilege. That evening, the Foundation hosted a fundraising dinner for London's progressive elite. Roland had become skilled at navigating these events, balancing aristocratic protocols with genuine discussion of social reform. He worked the room alongside Elias, introducing potential donors to project directors, facilitating connections between philanthropists and initiatives. He noticed Sterling Thornbury and Lady Victoria among the guests. They had donated to the Foundation, perhaps motivated by guilt or social pressure. Victoria approached Roland during the reception, her demeanor tentative. Your Grace, she said formally, I wanted to tell you, the work you are doing is remarkable. I've been volunteering at one of your reading societies, teaching women's literacy classes. Roland studied her with surprise. I did not know you were involved. I asked them not to mention it, Victoria admitted. I was uncertain whether you would welcome my participation given our history, but I have come to understand how wrong we were about you, about what matters. My brother, she glanced towards Sterling, who was speaking with other guests. Sterling married for wealth and status, as he always intended. He is miserable. His wife despises him. He despises himself, I think, though he would never admit it. And you? Roland asked gently. Are you content? I am unmarried, Victoria said with a slight smile. My family considers me dangerously radical for volunteering with your foundation and advocating for women's education rights. I have discovered I prefer this disapproval to the empty approval I once sought. So perhaps you inadvertently liberated me as well. She moved on to speak with other guests, leaving Roland thoughtful. Even those who had participated in his destruction were capable of growth and change. Perhaps redemption was available to everyone willing to question their assumptions and choose different paths. Near midnight, after the guests had departed and the staff had cleaned up, Roland and Elias stood together in the garden under a clear spring sky. London's perpetual fog had lifted temporarily, revealing stars rarely visible in the city. Do you ever regret it? Elias asked quietly. Choosing this life over the traditional ducal existence? You could have reclaimed your position in society, married appropriately, lived in comfort while doing charitable work from a safe distance. Not for a moment, Roland replied, their shoulders touching in the darkness where no one could observe. This is real. The other life would have been performance, maintaining appearances while accomplishing nothing significant. Here, I am known, not as a title or a scandal, but as myself. How could I regret that? We will never be entirely accepted, Elias warned. Society will always view us with suspicion, always question our arrangement. Then we will expand society's capacity for acceptance, Roland countered, just as we are doing with class barriers and educational access. Change requires people willing to live authentically, despite opposition. We can do that. Elias smiled in the darkness. Your idealism is one of your most endearing qualities. Also, occasionally naive. Perhaps, Roland conceded, but naive idealism directed toward concrete action produces results. We have already changed hundreds of lives directly, influenced policy debates, inspired others to similar work. That is not nothing. They stood together in comfortable silence. Two men who had found each other against improbable odds, who had built something meaningful from the wreckage of Roland's former life. The foundation would continue expanding. The causes they championed would face opposition. Their personal relationship would always exist in society's shadows. But they had something Sterling Thornbury, with all his cruel manipulation, had never understood. Genuine connection, purposeful work, and the freedom that comes from living according to one's own values rather than external expectations. Roland thought of the beggar he might have become without Mrs. Pembroke's intervention, standing on street corners with an extended hand. In a sense, he had become that beggar, someone outside the system's protection, dependent on charity and goodwill. But rather than destroying him, that position had enabled transformation. He had fallen from the golden cage and discovered he could fly. The future remained uncertain, full of challenges and opposition. Parliament would resist their proposed reforms. Conservative society would continue attacking their work as dangerous radicalism. Financial resources, however substantial, were finite and could not address every need. But Roland had learned something essential during his journey from aristocratic heir to disgraced outcast to reforming duke. Authentic purpose mattered more than comfortable security. Meaningful relationships transcended social approval, and the freedom to choose one's own path, even a difficult one, surpassed any amount of inherited privilege. He was Duke of Ashford, yes, but he had redefined what that title meant. Not a guardian of aristocratic exclusivity, but a bridge between worlds. Not a preserver of hierarchy, but an advocate for its transformation. Not a victim of scandal, but its beneficiary. Sterling Thornbury had intended to destroy him. Instead, he had freed him to become who he was always meant to be. And that, Roland reflected as he stood in the garden with Elias beside him and the Foundation's work stretching before them, was victory of the truest kind. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled.